Hello and welcome back to another episode of Advanced RC Adventures. This is a channel where we investigate, explore, build and explain, upgrade, and advance Nitro RCs to another level. Come start a new adventure with me. Today, we're going to be talking about the very vintage 40 plus year old ENYA 11CX, as well as why very inexpensive, not elaborate test stands can be important to helping you with your nitro break-ins, tuning, and setup. First, let's take a look at the engine. So we saw this engine on the other ENYA 11CX episode. So if you're interested in learning more and seeing all the internals and some of the history on the engine, feel free to go check out that video. On here, for at least the test stand purposes, maybe this will reach a nitro build as well, but we have a vintage MIP header. These headers are relatively interesting because of their flange design and the fact that they use a 440 thread on their threaded holes here. Most all of the headers that are used in this time period and now for small blocks use an M3 style thread. This header was originally black in color, as well as the pipe. That's been stripped off, wet sanded and polished. This is a vintage left-handed 2-chamber dynamite tune pipe. For the engine itself, it's pretty interesting. 40 years ago, they definitely had standards, but they were different. And since this was an engine that was originally put into an airplane, things are slightly different. The small block engine mount flanges, the hole spacing and the hole sizing to put onto the engine mounts themselves were slightly different. In order to make this work for a current day small block, but in this case for an RS4 potential 10 scale platform, I had to drill out the holes to 3.5 millimeter to make the spacing work for the engine mounts. These engine mounts are a radical Wolfpack design, silver polished, very vintage, something that's rare, but it very well matches and goes with the engine color and theme, being that it's a heat sink invented. The flywheel, clutch, and clutch bell here. This is a brand new but old stock I found from a Hong Kong vendor. This is from the period, it was brand new old stock, had it shipped over, flywheel 4-shoe race clutch setup for this particular engine. It still uses the prop nut or the drive washer. Had to put an 8mm washer, I think it was an M8 by 0.6 washer to have that spacing put out a little bit so that there's proper clearance. 4-shoe clutch, and I was worried at first that I wasn't going to be able to use a traditional bell on here, but after looking at the vintage instructions, it showed to trim a portion of the shoe in order to fit. And then this is an M1, a Mod 1 HPI clutch bell. This was, I put this on, one, it's nice to put on for your test stands so that you can try to check clutch engagement, and you'll see that in a little bit when we run the engine on the test stand. But also it helped to make sure that the shoe, the race clutch shoes, were going to work with a standard small block 10th scale clutch bell. Setup for the carburetor. I had first set it up initially on what I felt might work. So I had the high-speed needle turned out to 2.5 turns, which was what I felt was a good guess for the time period of the carb and the displacement of the engine. And I had the low-speed needle turned to flush to the outside. Later, I had found a document that talked about how they wanted the low-speed needle to be adjusted. So the way they described it is to open up the throttle, and then the spray bar down inside for the low-speed needle, they wanted a 0.7 to 0.8 millimeter spacing. So I had to find a piece of wire or something that had approximately that thickness, which was relatively small, and fit it down inside to get it started. What you'll notice though on the run is that I ended up having to adjust the low-speed needle and making that spray bar adjustment closer, effectively leaning it out to get the engine started. So that 0.7 to 0.8 millimeter spacing was simply, just like any other carb setting, just a guideline, a starting point. We have an OS standard length number 8 glow plug inside. And the reason why we picked that is ENYA says that they want their number 3 or number 4 plug, and after investigating that, that's just a standard length plug similar to the OS. And then when checking with the head button, it's perfectly spaced when the glow plug is screwed down right at the bottom of the compression bowl. It's flush with that, just like a turbo setup would be, so this is a perfect size. Now ENYA recommends a hot to a medium hot, and this is just a medium. Now every manufacturer uses a little bit different heat scale, and this number 8 works, but later on I might put an A3, which is a hot OS plug, or get some ENYA specific glow plugs for this engine and see if the timing, if the starting, if the running works any better. That'll be probably in a later episode, a later adventure when putting this engine into a formal car. So let's talk just a touch on test stands. This particular test stand that I have is an old belted 10 scale RS4 chassis, an old HPI fuel tank, and you don't need anything super elaborate. You need something to attach your engine to, a way to have a fuel tank, a way to have some type of exhaust mounted to your system. And this is just an old RS42 ready to run upper deck to kind of house it. It's always what I feel important, especially on test stands, but cars as well, to have some type of return spring for your throttle and some way to operate your throttle. Every situation is going to call for a little bit different, whether it's a rotary barrel carb or a slide carb. We have a ball link here, we have a link attachment here, and a way to pull it open, and this is a pretty slick way to operate the carburetor. So I use this RS4 platform a lot for my test stands. I have a silver version as well, and the reason being is that I'm a big 10 scale person which uses small block engines most frequently, and the RS4 platform, and you can adapt it. You can drill holes, you can slot out your holes as necessary for spacing. You do not have to worry about gear mesh because you're just running the engine. So you just need something, piece of wood. You can use an old RS4 chassis layout like I have here, or a Losi XXXNT, or whatever you feel appropriate. Use something that makes sense for what you're trying to do, and at the same time is a small package. This is a bump start engine, and so I just place it down on top of my bump starter, engage the flywheel with my bump start, and it works great. So feel free to use this idea, feel free to make one of your own. You need some type of exhaust. It doesn't have to be a side pipe. You can have a rear deflected pipe or whatever you want. You can use an airplane muffler, whatever you feel appropriate, just to do some testing. We blended some fuel for this engine. Though it's chrome-lined AAC construction, it probably could withstand today's fuels down to about 9% oil. But the manufacturer recommended 40 years ago to use 20% oil and somewhere between 0% nitro up to 20. Today we're going to be running a blend of Bones Brew 25% nitro. Started its life with 10% oil, doctored up with some clots to be able to get it up to 16%. I use somewhere in the world of 14-16% oil in all my ABNs, and so that should be pretty sufficient and have some good oil film for this engine at 16%. While we run the engine on the test stand, you're going to see throttle response. You're going to see a raw startup. He has all of your fuel settings are initial, regardless of what car you're doing. It is nice to have initial instruction from the manufacturer, but it's just a starting point. Depending on your altitude, depending on the temperature, depending on what fuel, depending on what glow plug range you use, everything's going to be slightly different. During the test start time period, we run a break-in tank. We do a few small throttle blips to be able to see where our settings are at, but the goal here is to try to re-break in this engine. This is a refreshed engine with brand new bearings, but it has all original internals. It has been run before. It's been completely torn down and refreshed, ready for the test stand, bringing back this 40-plus-year-old Nitro 12th and 10th scale race engine, ENYA 11CX. And what I learned with a little bit additional research is that this is actually a CT version. What that stands for is car touring. They had the airplane version, like I mentioned. Later on, they came out with a 15 size engine that had the same block, same cast head, and then they came out with later what they called an ultra version of the 11 and the 15, and that came with a billet CNC machined head, and the crank was slightly modified, and they moved away from the AAC, the aluminum piston, aluminum sleeve chrome line construction of this engine, which was adopted from the lightweight airplane version, and that AAC construction is inside of this engine. And for the Ultra, they moved to an ABN, so aluminum piston, brass sleeve inside, and chrome lined. There were a few AAC construction race engines for 8th scale and 10th scale in the past. It's not very common, but there's always pros and cons. The AAC gives a little bit more light weight to the engine, so if you wanted a little bit lighter chassis, overall weight and chassis to your buggy or to your touring car, AAC is something to look into. But the brass sleeves last a little bit longer, and they're a little bit more durable, have that longevity factor, but still this AAC as well as ABCs are chrome lined. Okay, so we're out here with the test stand. So let's do a little fill up on the test stand here. Give the engine a prime after we heat it up, and let's get this going. Whenever possible, you want to preheat your engine, even if it's an RTR engine. A lot of your RTR engines, for example, OS CB12 or 15, they're going to have a little bit less pinch, regardless if they're chrome line or nickel line. It's always, if you have the ability to warm it up, it's always good to. You always want to check down at the glow plug. Right now we're at 150, and I like to warm up my engine somewhere in between 165 to 210. So somewhere in the world of 180 to 200 is a good practice. A portable heat gun works absolutely great in these situations. You can move the heat around. If possible, you want to try to heat the block, not just the head. That helps distribute the heat for the engine, not just concentrated on the head and soak down. If you can move it all around. So now here we're at 174. I might touch it again with a little bit of heat to raise it up just a smidge in preparation to get everything nice and warm. So let's check it one more time. It's important not just to check the head temperature. You actually want to go down into the glow plug area and check. So we're still at that 170 mark. We're going to go ahead and prime the engine, and we're here on the bump starter. We're going to fire this 11CX ENYA race engine, 40 plus years old. Started up for the first time in 40 something years. So one thing before we do a first fire up, it's always awesome when you know it's going to fire up, but we're working off of some basic carb settings. This is a raw start. But we're at 2.5 turns out on the high speed, and it's interesting on the low speed how to set it, and we'll talk about that. And then we've got an idle gap roughly around 1 millimeter. first time in almost 40 years we have this race engine ENYA 11CX idling. You notice that I had to mess with low speed adjustment. I had to lean it out a little bit in order to get it running. Listen to that beautiful idle. We're going to let it warm up just a little bit. We're going to check temperature, and then we'll work on doing a couple small pulls just to see where we're at on initial idle tune. So your goal with your idle, in my opinion, you want to have the lowest idle you can possible. And so the idle gap and the low speed needle has to do a dance to try to find that sweet spot on low idle. But then as you start to pull on your throttle, you want to have good response too from your low speed. So you first try to get it running with your high speed adjustment and your low speed and your idle gap, and that's where we're at. We're at a nice stable idle. Sounds pretty good. I might do a small adjustment as it warms up to lower the idle gap and see where we're at. You can probably hear the tone or the frequency of the engine raising a little bit as it starts to warm up. And that's perfectly natural. That's why you never want to work on your tune until your engine's warmed up. It's imperative, whether it's on the test stand here or on the car, let your engine warm up for a minute or two before you start to even roll the car or the truck going. Notice here, it's always a good idea, if you can, to have your clutch installed onto your test stand. You don't have to, at least in a flywheel, but you can test out if your clutch initial setting is good. Make sure you're not rubbing. If you can use your finger to stop the clutch valve without hurting yourself, and of course be careful around the rotating parts, then you know that your initial clutch setting is good. Notice the idle, after you rev it, the idle goes back and there's no two-stage idle. The mixture is definitely rich, and that's what I want it to be, at least for this initial tank. Since this engine is not brand new, it's been previously broke in, even though I'll treat it as we're breaking it in, I will lean it a little bit on the test stand. But you won't be able to have a perfect tune until you have full load, and that's installed on a car or truck, and then you do a final tune. But the test stand is really important so that you can get an initial baseline. So we're going to let this first tank run out, keep the engine nice and lubricated, we're going to let the heat cycle go through, put the piston at bottom dead center, and then come back and start another tank, and we might do a little bit more tune, and you can see and hear how the engine revs a lot differently. So this is not intended to be a full break-in how-to video on break-ins, but just a couple points while we're here on the test stand. So your heat cycles between tanks, you generally want to let it sit for at least 15 minutes, and then you check your head temperature. And you want it to get to around ambient, and right now that is about ambient. Ambient is about 81, and that's what the head temp was. So once you do that, then you know that your heat cycle is complete. Just remember to put your flywheel back at bottom dead center so that the piston drops down and isn't at the top portion of the sleeve, so the pinch can relax and reset. So once you're fully cool, you're ready to fill up your tank, heat your engine up again, prime it, and then go ahead and start. With this being the second tank, I'm going to close my high speed. I was at 2.5 turns out to keep it on the rich setting. We're going to close it to about 2 to hopefully have a little bit better fuel consumption on the second tank, and I know it's still rich enough for proper lubrication for the bearing and the engine itself, but just slightly leaner. So we're going to close the high-speed needle and then use something as an indicator. There's a small hole here as my indicator. So that's 1, and then 2 turns. What the old instructions said is that you want to be somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 turns, so I know I'm safe there. Plus, it depends on your head temperature and fuel cut. So with experience, you know when your engine is running at kind of peak performance or on, you know, the edge of that lean to rich kind of setting. I run all my engines at, in quote, like an appropriate setting. That means I find fuel cut or I find my head temp at where I want to be depending on the ambient condition and the engine itself, because every engine is a little bit different. And you then do your final tune from there. You want to err on perhaps the rich side, so if you find fuel cut, for example, you want to keep running and you richen it up to where you don't have fuel cut, but then you check your head temp. And maybe it's a good rule just to give yourself an hour or 2 on the rich side, especially if you're bashing. If you're bashing and you're just doing street running, whether it's truck or touring car, err on the little bit side of rich so your engine can continue to stay healthy. If you're racing, it's a different situation. You want to be right on that borderline of running healthy but lean so you can have maximum performance. I always try to wait somewhere between 5-10 seconds to let that heat kind of absorb into the block so that you don't just pile the heat on top and then check your temp, and as it is absorbed into the block, that head temperature dissipates and gets lower. Alright, so there we go. We're just about 170 there. Let's set the prime and get her fired up once again. It's important to have some clear, transparent fuel tubing near the carb so that you can see what's happening with the fuel going in. Let your glow plug sit on there for a few seconds. There we go, get it running. The idle will even out as it starts to warm up and get the fuel circulated through the engine. Nice clean second tank startup. We'll let it warm up. We'll do a little throttle blip, check our temperature, and do a slight tune after it warms up for a minute or two. And then she'll be good to go to either continue a full break-in process or go on to a car at a later date. Generally speaking, on the test stand, you can do your 1, 2, 3, and sometimes 4 idle tanks. A break-in is generally what I do, and then I'll take it off the test stand and then put it into the car to complete the remainder break-in tanks. So there we go. Starting to warm up a little bit, slightly leaner. So what we have here is a situation where we're still very rich. We pull on it and it floods the engine. So we might be needing to adjust the low speed needle a small amount. Now, if you're going full throttle and you let it go and it stalls, then you might be starving the engine. How the idle returns back nicely. No two-stage idle. We're now able to crack the throttle and RPM will increase without bogging down. We have a nice plume of smoke coming out. Partly is because the increased oil concentration, but also with the needle settings, we know that we still have plenty of oil going through the engine. Nice throttle response coming from the carb. And these engines were not designed to have a nice tuned pipe setting. So carburetor settings at the moment are good, and the tuned pipe helps to have nice, crisp throttle response. I can tell there's a small amount of two-stage idle now that the engine's warming up, so I can back my low-speed needle to maybe an hour or two more rich to help with that. The fitment on the O-ring to the low-speed needle to the carb is pretty tight, so I'm having to hold the carb either open or closed slightly to make that adjustment, because what's happening is I'm turning the low-speed needle and it's opening or closing the carb barrel. we've got no two-stage idle. But I notice as we blip the throttle, it's a little bit rich. It wasn't as perfect response, so we're going to have to find that middle ground on tune. So here we are, just right at 200. The perfect temp, idle temp, as we do a basic idle tune and mid-range acceleration tune. Now that we know we have a good basic low and mid-range tune, we're going to let this tank run through, clear out the engine, and then we know we have a good baseline for when the engine eventually goes on to a touring car. This 11CX has 0.3 to 0.4 horsepower and had a max RPM range of 27 to 28,000 RPM. The Ultra had the same RPM range, but because of the sleeve modification and the timing for the crank, they were able to wiggle out a small amount more horsepower, and as I understand it, it raised that range from 0.4 to 0.5 horsepower. So that's very similar to the 12E and the 15FE HPI Showa made Toki branded small block engines. Feel free to like, share, and subscribe. And if you like anything 10th scale, nitro, and especially touring cars, then this is the place to be. So thanks for taking the adventure with me.